In this video, we will take a look at the Caller REST API feature in Compleo. From the list of processes that can be applied from run mode, select Caller REST API option. Under the Request Configuration tab, you need to define the parameters necessary to make the desired API call. Select a method from this drop-down. In this video, we will be looking at an example of an invoicing process. So I will select the post method for this example. Enter here the URL or address of the API that you want to access, or you can also select a variable. Click here to add the required parameters for the API call. This requires a key and the value associated with that key to successfully pass the parameter with the request. For this example, we do not require any additional parameters. From the Authorization tab, you can select the type of authorization necessary to authenticate access to the API. There are three options. You can choose the API key authorization option, for which you will need to enter a key and the value associated with it. Next, you can select the bearer token option, for which you will have to define a token for request authorization. Here you can either directly input the token or retrieve a token using another API request. The last one is a basic authorization option, which requires you to enter your username and password for authorizing your API request. For this example, we will request for a bearer token that will be fetched using another API call. Here, configure all the necessary details to fetch the authorization token. From the Headers tab, you can define parameters that are to be associated with the metadata of the API request. You can add API details in the Body tab by using one of three options. You can select this option to use generated output file as the body for the API request, or select this option to specify an external file as the body, or lastly, you can select this option to define the body in the window itself. For this example, we will enter the body required to complete the API request for this invoicing process. You can use this window to see a sample of the response that will be received from the API call. Click on the Send button to do so. Next, we have the Response Processing tab, which allows you to handle and process the response received after a successful execution of the API request. There are two options here. The first one allows you to save the received response locally, and you can define the location where it will be saved. You can also custom name the file for easier reference or differentiation. And there is also an option to save only a specific property of the file. All the data received from the API is automatically listed as individual properties in this dropdown. You can select the desired property, and only that will be saved in the defined location. In case the data is received in an unreadable base64 format, you can select this option, which decodes base64 into human readable format. The second option allows you to start the process of a document using the values that were received from the API request. There are three options for you to choose the input file. Select the first option if you want the file on which the API request was executed to be the input file for the process. The second option is if you want the properties returned from the API to be the input document for the process. Again, here you can choose to select only a specific property as the input for the process and give it a file name. The third option allows you to define an external file as an input for the process. This last parameter is for you to choose either to define a folder where the final process documents will be saved along with its variable file, which consists of the response values, or you can choose to add the process document to a process queue in Compleo Supervisor. Upon selecting this option, you will have to define the necessary settings in the process queue window. You can check out our video on working with process queues and REST APIs in Compleo Supervisor. In this example, for the first option, let's define a location and custom name the file as test API. For the second option, we will choose to process the input document itself at another location. Upon successful execution of the API request, the responses will be saved accordingly in the designated folders.